Hello and welcome. Here you'll find wonderfully boring bedtime stories, perfect for drifting off into peaceful sleep. If you enjoy calming tales that help you unwind, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let us lull you to dreamland every night. In the cupboard beside the tea, among jars that smelled like breakfast and jars that smelled like regret, lived a small brown bottle with a cork that sighed when it opened. It was the sort of object that pretended to be medicinal and succeeded mostly because it wore glass like a halo. If anyone asked, it belonged to the household the way stairs belong to a house, as essential as spoons, but more persuasive. She did not consider herself weak. Delicacy, after all, was a social posture, something you pinned to the front of your dress alongside the brooch. But mornings had a way of scraping the mind raw. There was the coal that never learned to behave, the child with a new grievance about the shape of porridge, a husband who breathed with policy-making conviction, and a neighbourhood orchestra of door knockers arriving precisely when she'd resolved not to need anyone. It was all very civil and frequently unbearable. On the worst mornings she reached for the bottle as one might reach for a window latch, a little motion to relieve pressure. Cork, sigh, drops, wink. Tea, darker by degrees and kinder by intention. She watched the swirl settle like fog drawing curtains across a harbour everything familiar, and somehow softer now that it was half concealed. One sip. The railing inside her chest stopped rattling. The sharp corners of the world rounded off, as if they had been sent to finishing school. Conversation retreated to an agreeable distance. The clock ticked with more humility. And if the wallpaper seemed to breathe well, it was a polite breath, and she was too well brought up to correct it. There was a script to being a woman of her decade and street and income. It started with a quiet voice and ended with an early bedtime. The body was expected to pose like porcelain and feel like still water. Feeling too much was considered a draught. One shut the window and blamed the wind. The bottle merely assisted the window. It required no confession. It liked you silent. If you had asked the chemist, he would have performed the solemn little dance of the counter. Papers, scales, a nod in Latin, another in English, one last in sheer commerce. A respectable ritual to reassure a respectable woman that what she bought was not indulgence but remedy. The label said, for nerves. The price said, for everyone. The chemist said, as needed, which was a splendid empty phrase that meant as often as you can afford. She adopted the phrase the way one adopts a stray word. It lived in her day. There were needed mornings and needed afternoons, and profoundly needed evenings when dinner attempted treason. She came to understand that a few drops could smooth the hour between guests and dessert, that another few could quiet the thunder of being looked at all day, then overlooked at night. To pour was to edit the self, the scene, the century. The bottle did not cure, it curated. Neighbours called this composure. They admired her posture. She endured their admiration with grace and a worked-out system of teaspoons. It was not that she wanted to forget. Forgetting felt dishonest. She only wanted her grief to speak Latin and wear nice shoes. The bottle was very good at that. By and by she discovered the house had preferences. The sitting room liked 2 drops, and the piano lid open by exactly 3 inches. The dining room preferred a sturdier dash, especially when men discussed railways as though they themselves were steam. In the nursery, nothing was poured. Nothing poured openly, because infants have moral zealots for witnesses. But there were other bottles there, paler as if innocence were a solvent, and innocence, as every mother learns, is noisy. If she had owned a truth to set down on paper, it might have been this. She did not begin with longing. She began with chores. Longing arrived later, disguised as relief. It is a universal habit of rooms to practice memory on their occupants. Her drawing room remembered the day the window stuck and how she laughed once, a sudden, unruly laugh, when a visitor praised the virtue of silence. Her bedroom remembered the sound of a cork at night. The kitchen remembered the first time she spilled a measure into custard, and then, surprised by the result, wrote "depth" in the margin of a recipe. The house too learned to sip. We are inclined to call this decadence when the curtains are velvet and survival when they are calico. Inside it feels the same, a reprieve with table manners. When friends came, the bottle hid in plain sight. Respectability is a camouflage that needs only a label and a well-shaped glass. The conversation would stroll through weather, salute a scandal, meander past the flowers in the park, then take its rest. Inevitably on the subject of female nerves, which were considered an architectural feature, the in-house staircase to hysteria. The men chuckled at the topography. The women drank the map. "Isn't it marvellous," someone would say, "how a little dose restores cheer?" Marvellous was an excellent word. Positive, indefinite, nothing like precise enough to hold grief or history. Marvellous is how you describe a miracle you did not earn. She accepted marvels as a matter of housekeeping, yet there was an arithmetic of calm, and it did not always come out in her favour. Teaspoons grew ambitious, sleep grew porous. The needle in her hand at embroidery trembled like a small animal. She developed an ability to nod at two topics at once, and sometimes, when she looked at her daughter, she felt the ache of being observed by a pair of eyes that had not learned the trick of detachment. On such days, she tried to abstain. Abstinence is a heroic word. In practice, it is a chair with splinters. The world regained its edges with punitive speed. Sound returned from wherever it had gone on holiday. Every fabric itched. Every errand acquired theological weight. By noon, she would stand before the cupboard and think very seriously about the meaning of "as needed." The language was generous. She learned to be too. No one warned her about the drift. Dependence is not a cliff but a gently sloped afternoon. One day you notice you are further from the door than you meant to be. People praise the view. You praise the view. It is still a slope. What she did not know but would eventually understand was that the bottle had a second hobby besides quieting rooms. It revised time. Each swallow normalized the next. The present became a little hallway between doses. Once you live in hallways long enough, rooms feel like an interruption. She began to prefer corridors. There was a dinner. There are always dinners in lives like hers. They multiply like obligations. The roast was too proud of its origins. The potatoes had theories. A cousin spoke with the certainty of someone who had recently discovered the moral utility of tariffs. Her husband earnestly proposed to explain drains. She felt herself becoming both bone-tired and effervescent, a combination familiar to palaces and prisons. Under the table, her hand found her purse. Inside the purse, the bottle warm from nearness breathed its fugitive sweetness. She performed a study in discretion, a tilt, a drop, a stir, a regret postponed. The wine put on a velvet coat and bowed, her spine unknotted. The table stretched wider, and with it grew a blissful capacity to forgive the existence of cousins. Someone asked a child to recite a poem that was longer than winter. She arranged her face into the expression that means I am listening and trying very hard. When dessert arrived, she felt her mind float several inches above her manners. This is the altitude at which compromises are made. No one commented. They rarely did, provided her hair remained orderly, and the conversation did not stray into revolutions. The secret of certain circles is that nobody wants the truth to interrupt the tea. Composure is a communal lie. It tastes of clove and plausible deniability. After the guests had gone, she examined her reflection and recognized the small delays in her reaction. The way recognition arrived with a velvet cape and a soft apology for being late. She placed the bottle beside her brush and thought, tomorrow, less. The body, however, is a parliament of appetites. Tomorrow voted, and the eyes had it. The nursery is the true parliament of a house. Nothing is passed there without a cry. Even so, cries can be amended. There was a white bottle with blue letters promising ease to the small. No cork sighed. It clicked. Innocence, it turns out, likes modern closures. A teaspoon measured out a compromise between exhaustion and affection. The child slept. There is no silence more persuasive than the silence of a sleeping child to a woman whose temples have been ringing for a month. She stood over the cradle like a penitent who has just found an indulgence she can afford. Complicated relief is still relief. She wept very quietly and told herself that sleeping was a kind of love. It is sometimes, but love asks questions. Labels do not. The next day the child slept again. The house floated through its chores as if the air had been stirred with a soft spoon. She set aside embroidery and tidied the corner of the room where guilt sits on a stool, pretending to be a cushion. The bottle waited on the mantel. Everything looked possible. Night came and she could not remember how many days she had been alive. The mind learns to take up less space when the body's determined to occupy a smaller life. She brewed tea that tasted of afternoon and finally confessed to the chair that she wished to be less awake. What begins as sanctuary can become strategy. She learned routes to chemists that made no pattern. She learned which hats suggested sick aunt and which suggested shopping. She learned that a forgeable signature is best copied with a glove tucked under the wrist to prevent eagerness from revealing itself. She told herself it was all profoundly unromantic. Who, after all, wishes to be a plotter in pharmacies? And yet she grew deft. Addiction makes strategists of the reluctant. At one shop, the boy with the ink-stained fingers grew curiously attentive. At another, the man with the whiskers longer than his logic developed a habit of checking her hands for tremors. A third, inconveniently pious, advised rest and broth. "I sell both," he said gravely, "but only one helps." She smiled with the decency of a person who has no intention of taking advice. At home, the staff learned the choreography. The maid's feet memorized the lane between front door and bedchamber, the way rain memorizes slate. She began to say "dear" to the maid in a voice that paid a tip. It is a measure of certain women's desperation that they will practice politeness as a form of bribery toward people they are already paying. The maid, who'd grown up with more practical gods, said "yes, ma'am" to the money and "no, ma'am" inside her head. She fetched the bottle and kept the secret, and on bad days moved the mirror out of reach. Secrets accrue interest. Each week charged its fee. She woke some mornings with a fog where ambition should be. Once she tried to write a letter to a friend advising sunshine and fresh air. The sentences wandered off like children released at a fair. She kept the letter anyway. We keep evidence of the selves we intend to be. There were moments of chivalry from her body, brave little hours when sleep arrived unassisted, and she woke without ghost hands tugging at her nerves. On those days she loved everything with an almost reckless tenderness. The dent in the pillow, the sparrow committing politics on the sill, the combustion of toast into a domestic miracle. She promised herself a new life and meant it. Promises are a currency with a generous exchange rate in the morning and terrible inflation by dusk. The doctor was a man built like a sideboard and decorated with the kind of authority that trains rooms to hush. He loved method more than he loved women, which made him trustworthy in ways that mattered and ridiculous in ways that did not. He used words like condition and regimen, and sometimes allowed his eyes to perform sympathy while his hands performed fees. She told him about nerves as if nerves were a storm that her body had been unwise enough to schedule. He steepled his fingers with vocational gravity and blessed a routine that began with tincture and ended with rest. The middle was patience, which he dispensed in a bottle. "Do not worry yourself," he said, which is a phrase designed to fail. Worry is a profession in certain houses. He wrote her name differently than it appears in the parish register and called it discretion. She called it kindness until she realized it allowed him to forget her. He meant well. He meant profit. He meant to leave before the truth made his tea cold. She did not ask what was in the bottle because the answer was the same as always, enough to persuade. There is a point beyond which the body learns your tricks and develops better ones. She found herself dosing not for relief, but to avoid the particular terror of being without relief. It is a delicate distinction with crude consequences. The house began to observe her the way an audience watches a tightrope walker who has become too fond of the rope. There were days when everything she was fell through. She spoke slowly, as if each word must be coaxed into the light with sugar on its tongue. She carried the weight of her own head with professional concentration and discovered new uses for table edges and the backs of chairs. She gave up on being vivid and decided to be picturesque. It is easier to be adored for your pallor than forgiven for your need. On a cold afternoon, she tried not to take anything, and found herself reading a page of a book over and over while understanding none of it. The letters marched with unnecessary discipline. The clock clanged its progress through an hour that gained weight as it moved. She got up, sat down, stood again, forgot why, and then remembered only that the cupboard existed. She opened it. She closed it. She found the courage of someone trying to be good in a world that paid better for being numb. She lasted until evening. Then she poured less than usual, and still watched the room exhale in gratitude. It is difficult to argue with a result that says please. She told herself she was not giving in. She was giving grace to everyone who had to live with her. Altruism makes an excellent disguise for surrender. We like to believe reforms arrive as trumpets. In truth, most households reform privately and with poor posture. She rehearsed confession while folding towels, to her husband, to the maid, to the child whose eyes had the unmerciful brightness of a new soul. Each imagined conversation collapsed under the weight of its own good intentions. She put the towels away and told herself that tomorrow would be a stronger verb. When the child cried that night, honestly cried, from gums and outrage and the bewilderment of being new, she found the small blue-lettered bottle and stared at it as if it had spoken. The label, relentless in its courtesy, told her everything except the truth. She unscrewed the cap and hesitated long enough to feel noble. Then she measured a compromise and watched innocence sleep like a lesson nobody wanted to learn. She did not sleep. Sleep requires a pact with yourself, and she could not remember the terms. In the morning, the garden looked like a place where better people lived. She stepped outside and let the air instruct her lungs. It was too honest to bear for long. She retreated, poured a transparent mercy, and described the sensation to herself with the authority of a catalogue. Peace, portable, distress, deferred, sorrow, carefully boxed for later. There was no later large enough. It is fashionable, in certain circles, to turn frailty into an art form so persuasive that nobody recognizes the labor behind it. When invited to a private gathering lamplight curated, roses overperforming in cut crystal, she found herself among women who knew how to recline like metaphor. They sipped from goblets and called their malaise a salon. She watched the room unspool a mythology of cultivated languor and understood how easily addiction becomes an aesthetic when lined in satin. They spoke of visions and music and the sort of dreams that sound expensive. Somewhere in the story, the body's chemistry lost its name and acquired velvet. She played along for an hour. She admired the pale. She admired the sound of sighs in minor keys. She admired the absence of curiosity about consequences. Then she felt a thread inside her tug hard, the one that tied her to the kitchen, where guilt kept its apron, and she left before the metaphor devoured her. On the way home, she walked quickly, as if she had stolen something from time. The pavement disagreed with her ankles. The sky had the colour of a bruise about to explain itself. She arrived, pressed her forehead to the doorframe, and listened for the child's breath, which is the only clock that matters in a certain kind of life. Inside, the maid had arranged the room to absorb collapse if necessary. Chair at advantageous angle, shawl stationed like a guard, tea waiting in a cup that did not accuse. The bottle sat beside it with the poise of a guest who knows it cannot be refused. She sat, and the house exhaled, and the evening drifted toward the place where decisions blur. She did not pour, or she did. The truth in houses like this often wears two dresses and answers to whichever name promises sleep. She slept enough to dream badly and woke with the conviction that she had become a story told by furniture. The first attempt at quitting was theatrical by necessity. Rituals help when resolve is still superstitious. She collected the bottles, large, small, almost empty, almost honest, and deposited them in a sack that smelled faintly of old starch and humiliation. She carried the sack into the garden as if it contained the family silver and the family shame, which, in a way, it did. She dug with an energy that felt like apology, and buried the glass like seeds of a future she hoped would refuse to sprout. Her hands shook. The earth accepted the bargain without comment. The maid watched from the back step with the composed attention of someone who had attended many private ceremonies and learned which ones to applaud. The child inside erupted into the sort of cry that clarifies the soul. She went back to the house and held a future that wriggled. The night was long and had all the manners of a bad guest. She sweated and shivered and petitioned angels she did not usually visit. The clock made its case for despair 12 times. She learned the geometry of ceilings and discovered that guilt is heavier when you are sober enough to lift it. At dawn, she found herself promising to tell the truth and meaning it. Morning is where meaning lives. She kept the promise until noon. There lived in her a companionship of contradictions. She wanted to be seen and she wanted to vanish. She yearned for sympathy and feared exposure. She craved guidance and would not be told. The bottle was the only relationship that asked nothing and took everything. There was comfort in the clarity of that theft. It was not that no one cared. It was that care arrived in the wrong shapes. The doctor had a schedule, the husband had opinions, the neighbours had ears, The maid had hands that carried and eyes that bore witness. The child had a need that was so total it felt like sunlight, brilliant, generous, and impossible to look at directly for long. She failed them all in intervals and made amends in teaspoons. On a day scrubbed clean by rain, she sat at the writing desk and began a letter to someone she'd not yet met, a future version of herself, perhaps, or a stranger who would be kind because they had no idea who she'd been. She wrote, "I am tired of being exquisite and absent. I would like to be present and ordinary. Please advise." Then she stopped, because advice is a currency best spent from one person to another, and she had not yet learned how to be two. She folded the letter anyway and placed it under the brush beside the space where a bottle used to sit. Sometimes ritual is the scaffolding of a new building, even when the ground still smells of old foundations. That evening she brewed tea without ceremony and watched the steam perform its temporary miracles. The maid entered with the unassuming gravity of a witness and set down a plate of bread that did not apologize for being bread. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. The words hurt and healed at the same time. "Would you like the tonic, ma'am?" The maid asked, not as a servant who obeys, but as a person who has delivered many choices to the same door and learned to knock differently. "No," she said. Then, because she was a coward and because courage is a muscle that shakes when first used, she added, "Not yet." The maid nodded like a door closing softly. She left. The room expanded by an inch, enough to breathe without translating it into prettiness. She ate the bread as if it were a confession. She drank the tea as if weather could be swallowed. When the child cried, she went and did not measure any compromises. It took a very long time to be human. She was not very good at it, but goodness is a skill you practice by failing in smaller ways each day. She slept, a thin, honest sleep, and woke with the sense that the house had shifted to accommodate a new kind of silence, one that did not come bottled. Her morning broke and found her undecorated. She dressed slowly in the ordinary, which is to say she put on clothes that fit a life rather than a legend. The mirror returned the favour by showing her a face with intentions. She went downstairs and made breakfast without performance. The child distributed crumbs across a nation of tile. The maid swept with a mercy that did not announce itself. The husband read the paper as if it contained the weather of empires and occasionally looked up to confirm that his house still had a horizon. At the edge of the garden, the buried place sat like an unlettered graveside. She thought of planting something there. Beans, perhaps. Beans have a work ethic. Then decided on flowers because she wanted beauty that did not require an explanation. The soil accepted the seeds and promised nothing, which is the same promise the bottle once made, only truer. She turned back toward the house and felt the ache inside her make a small, gracious bow. Pain, when it realizes you're not running, becomes polite. She had forgotten that. She had forgotten many things. Recovery is a form of remembering. "Walk?" she asked the child, who did not understand the question but understood the invitation. They stepped onto the path together, clumsy and brave. The sky performed its best blue. The day made room. The rest cure. There was a time when people believed that silence could mend a soul the way stitching mends fabric. They called it rest, as if the mind were a table that merely needed polishing. But rest, when prescribed by men in waistcoats, often meant absence. Absence of noise, of motion, of choice. And when the prescription arrived at her door, folded into her husband's suggestion, and sealed with concern, it sounded almost kind. "You need a change of air," he said, buttering his guilt along with the toast. She smiled. From what to what? He did not answer. Men rarely did when the question involved introspection. By noon, the carriage was ready. A small trunk, a maid she didn't know, a letter of introduction to the physician in charge of Willowmere House, a name chosen clearly to sound more like a meadow than an institution. Her husband kissed her forehead, not like a lover, but like a man returning a borrowed object in good condition. The wheels turned, and the city folded behind her like a closing fan. The road stretched into civility, hedgerows trimmed as if afraid of gossip, fields that practiced serenity for the benefit of travellers. The maid tried to make conversation and failed because conversation requires two people who wish to be seen. She only wished to vanish. When the gates appeared, iron, floral, confident, she felt the peculiar exhaustion that comes from being classified. The sign read, Willowmere, a retreat for ladies of delicate health. She wondered whether there existed a place for women of indelicate health, and decided that it was called the World. The building itself was beautiful in the way graves are beautiful, proportionate, quiet, symmetrical. Inside, the walls wore restraint. Even the wallpaper seemed to whisper. A nurse in crisp white met her at the door, her smile precise, like punctuation in a book written for men. "You'll find peace here," the nurse said. Peace. The word had been following her for years, offering its services like a persistent suitor. It always arrived with conditions. Her room overlooked a garden trimmed into obedience. Beyond the hedge, fields shifted under the wind like the skirts of unseen women. The bed was wide enough for virtue and narrow enough for despair. On the table stood a single glass bottle, because every institution has its sponsor, and a note in a careful hand. For sleep. 1 measure after supper. Dr. Finch will see you in the morning. She sat on the edge of the bed and read the note again, wondering if the handwriting belonged to pity or habit. The maid unpacked in silence. Drawers filled themselves with folded normalcy. Outside, the evening spread like a calm conspiracy. When the nurse brought broth, it tasted of surrender. When she brought the medicine, it smelled of memory. She drank both, because refusal required more personality than she currently possessed. Sleep came like velvet over the face. Days at Willowmere repeated themselves with the serenity of clockwork. Morning tea, measured walks, supervised embroidery, silence until luncheon. Every hour was a gentle instruction to stop being herself. Dr. Finch visited twice a week. He was a tall man of average insight who believed women were like weather, best discussed, rarely understood, and occasionally corrected with the right barometer. He inquired about her appetite, her dreams, her vexations of the spirit. She gave him answers that would fit neatly in his notes. He called her progress encouraging. She called it paralysis with manners. In the afternoons, she walked among the other women spectres in pastel, drifting through the garden paths with books they never read. They spoke in fragments. Do you find the sleep tincture effective? Some nights. I've written to my husband twice, no answer. They say correspondence disturbs recovery. Yes, of course. How considerate. Their laughter, when it came, sounded like porcelain being tapped for flaws. She tried to write once. The nurse confiscated the paper gently. Doctor's orders, she said. Too much thinking agitates the nerves. The pencil was replaced by a teacup. Time dissolved there, not like sugar but like bone. Seasons shifted only in the flowers. Snow came and someone was quietly taken away in a covered carriage. No one spoke of her again. The empty chair at meals was absorbed by the pattern of the tablecloth. When the bottle on her nightstand emptied, another appeared, identical except for the handwriting on its label. Sometimes she imagined the ink changing itself while she slept. Each sip was both rebellion and obedience. She had become a well-behaved storm. On certain evenings she stood by the window and tried to recall her daughter's face, but the memory arrived with too much light around the edges. She whispered apologies into the glass until her breath blurred the world beyond. One night, she dreamt she was walking through her own house, calling names that echoed but never answered. The rooms were empty except for bottles, hundreds of them, each one humming faintly, as if rehearsing the hymn of forgetfulness. She woke with her hands clenching the sheets, whispering, "Enough." But the morning nurse heard only, "Tea." After 8 months, Dr. Finch pronounced her improved. Improvement at Willowmere meant compliant eyes and slower speech. Her husband signed papers. The carriage returned. The road home looked shorter, though she was older by years, measured in silence. At the door, the maid, her old maid, greeted her as if curtsying to a ghost that might or might not remember its previous life. The house smelled faintly of lavender and caution. On the mantel sat a photograph of her daughter, now taller, unsmiling. The sight produced a tremor that reached her fingertips. "How is she?" "Well, Ma'am," the maid said, "she keeps her own counsel." A statement that could describe anyone in the family. That night she unpacked in the same room she had left behind, familiar yet foreign. The bed seemed to hold the indentation of her former self. On the table, as before, waited a small brown bottle. "For sleep," the note said in her husband's tidy indifference. She laughed quietly. The sound startled even her. She did not drink. Not that night. Morning arrived like an apology. She rose early, walked through rooms that had learned to live without her, and paused at the nursery door. The child was awake, reading at the window. When she turned, her gaze held something too steady for a girl that age, an inheritance of vigilance. "Good morning," the woman said. The girl nodded. "You look better." A compliment or a question, it didn't matter. It pierced. They ate breakfast together. No one mentioned Willowmere. The husband read the paper. The maid served tea. Normalcy arranged itself with the precision of stage scenery. But later, alone, she found the courage to open the cupboard again, not to take, but to count. There were fewer bottles than before. One was hidden under a lace cloth, another in the sewing basket. She gathered them slowly as if handling relics. Each had a story condensed in amber. Each said the same word, maybe. She carried them to the garden. The soil accepted glass with its usual discretion. When the last one disappeared beneath the earth, she felt an absurd urge to apologize to the worms. "It's not your fault," she whispered. "We all eat what we're given." Her daughter watched from the porch, saying nothing. Some lessons are taught by gesture. In the following weeks, she discovered that living without the bottle was not peace, but participation. Everything demanded something of her. Light, sound, thought, each insisted on being felt. It was unbearable and miraculous. Her hand shook when she sewed, but the stitches held. Her mind wandered, but it came back. The child began to ask questions again. Small, ordinary questions about bread and weather, and why flowers face the sun. She answered each one as if it were the beginning of a language she was relearning. At night she sometimes dreamt of the garden, and the buried bottles glowing faintly like trapped stars. She imagined roots curling around them, drawing out what remained of the poison until the flowers above bloomed pale and tremulous. Maybe that was redemption, not erasure, but transformation. Still, some evenings were cruel. Habit has long fingers. The craving was not for the taste, but for the hush. She would sit by the fire, cup in hand, and negotiate with the air. Just one, the air would suggest, not for pleasure, for quiet. She would shake her head, sometimes too late, sometimes not. Progress is a verb with an uneven gait. Then came a letter-thin paper, grey seal from Willowmere. Inside, a polite notice. We regret to inform you of the passing of Dr. Finch. His contributions to the field of female tranquility will be remembered. She stared at the phrase female tranquility until the ink blurred. How many bottles had been justified by those words? How many women had been praised for lying still enough to be forgotten? She folded the letter once, twice, and fed it to the fire. The flames flared blue, the colour of ink releasing its secrets. When her daughter entered the room, she said, "Mother, why are you crying?" "Because someone taught me silence," she said, "and I finally heard it." The child came closer, awkward but brave, and laid a small hand over hers. It was the simplest, oldest remedy in the world. Touch. No tincture, no dosage, no doctor could improve upon it. Spring came late that year, hesitant but sincere. The garden bloomed unevenly, which she found reassuring. Perfection had always been overrated. In the corner where the bottles slept, the flowers were taller, paler, and more fragrant, as if nourished by confession. She knelt there one morning and spoke softly, not to the earth, but to herself. Let this be the last inheritance. The wind, polite as ever, did not argue. From the house, her daughter called for tea. The voice was clear, untroubled. She stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and went inside, leaving the past to compost into something less dangerous. It was perhaps the first honest piece she had ever owned. The daughter's inheritance. The first thing she remembered was the sound of glass, not shattering. No, that would have been honest, but the small, polite chime of bottles touching each other inside a cupboard. It was a lullaby of caution, the secret music of her childhood. When she was very small, she thought all mothers owned cupboards that sang in amber tones. Later she realized that some mothers had cupboards full of flour, others of books, and hers full of silence in bottles. Her name was Clara, though in the house it was mostly darling or hush. Both words meant be small. By the time she learned to read, she had also learned to interpret air, the way it thickened before an argument, the hush that meant her mother was tired, the particular weight of footsteps that meant tonight would be quieter than usual. Children, if left alone with enough secrecy, become expert barometers. Her mother, recovered but never unshadowed, lived with the deliberate grace of someone afraid of sudden movements. She smiled often, but only from the lips. The laughter that once lived higher in the chest had retreated somewhere behind her ribs, too fragile to risk exposure. Still, she was gentler now, as if every word had been soaked in apology before it reached the child. They spent mornings in the garden. Clara learned the names of flowers and which ones the bees preferred. Her mother spoke softly, as if even the blossoms could overhear judgment. Sometimes she caught her mother staring at the patch where the earth rose slightly, where the bottle slept. When she asked what was buried there, her mother said, "Mistakes, my love. Don't water them too much. It became their private joke, though Clara never truly laughed. Even at 10, she suspected jokes about sorrow were merely disguises. Her father was a man of habits and schedules, not cruelties. His brand of absence was respectable, which made it harder to accuse. He managed the accounts, read the paper, and practiced the art of existing nearby. Clara loved him the way one loves a clock. He was reliable, comprehensible, and somehow never hers. When guests came, the house became a stage again. Mother in lace, father in his most articulate waistcoat, Clara performing the well-trained daughter. The air shimmered with the effort of pretending things were as they should be. After the guest departed, her mother would exhale like someone returning from war. Once, Clara caught her mother sitting by the window long after midnight, holding an empty teacup as though listening to something inside it. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Practicing being awake," her mother whispered. Clara never forgot that answer. It sounded like both victory and defeat. Just when she turned 12, she found one of the old bottles, not in the garden. Those were buried too deep, but in a drawer of sewing supplies, tucked behind a spool of blue thread. It was small, with a faded label that read for nerves. The liquid inside had thickened to the colour of secrets. She held it to the light and imagined it breathing. That night, she showed it to her mother. Her mother froze, then smiled. A slow, trembling smile that seemed borrowed. "Ah, I must have missed that one. Why did you keep it? I thought I'd thrown them all away." Clara waited. Her mother sighed. "Maybe I didn't trust peace to stay." She took the bottle from Clara's hand, walked to the fireplace, and poured it into the flames. The scent rose sharp and bitter, like flowers at a funeral. They stood together, silent witnesses to a chemical ghost. Years folded. The century turned its page. The house aged gently, as if time respected its quiet. Clara grew tall, serious, unsentimental. The kind of girl who looked as though she'd been reading since before she could walk. The neighbourhood called her clever. Her teachers called her reserved. The truth was simpler. She had learned early that emotion was expensive and rarely refunded. Her mother grew frailer in appearance but firmer in will. There was a steadiness to her now, carved from years of fighting invisible wars. The two of them lived in a rhythm of cautious affection, each afraid of breaking the other's balance. But the world outside was changing. Factories hummed. Women spoke louder. Newspapers began printing words like suffrage and temperance. The chemists, those discreet priests of domestic despair, were now required to record sales of opiates. Bottles acquired warning labels. Respectable households found other ways to anesthetize themselves. Prayer, gossip, brandy. Clara watched the transformation with curiosity. She had inherited not her mother's illness, but her attention to pain. One winter afternoon, as snow drifted like indecision, she found her mother writing. Not letters, those had ceased years ago, but something that looked like confession. Page after page of slanted handwriting, neat at first, then desperate. "Are you writing a story?" Clara asked. Her mother looked up, startled. "No, a remembering. Will you let me read it?" "When it's finished." "When will that be?" Her mother smiled faintly. "When I stop needing to write." The pages multiplied. Clara sometimes caught phrases like "the bottle that lied kindly" or "silence shaped like a woman." She didn't understand all of it, but she recognized the tone, the sound of someone finally speaking after years of whispering. Then, one evening, her mother stopped. She sealed the pages in an envelope and wrote on it, "For when I am no longer useful." Clara wanted to ask what that meant, but she didn't. Some questions arrived with their own funerals attached. In her 17th year, the first tremor came. It was small, a flutter in her mother's hands, noticeable only when she poured tea. "Just age," she said, "or perhaps nerves." The word landed like a curse. Clara pretended not to hear the echo. Within months the tremors worsened. The doctor prescribed rest and tonics, harmless restoratives, he called them. Clara demanded to see the ingredients. When she read morphia on the label, something ancient and furious rose in her throat. "No," she said, "not this." Her mother's eyes softened. "It's different now. Measured. Controlled." "It's the same lie in a cleaner bottle." Her mother laughed, a sound too brittle to sustain. "You've become fierce. I must have done something right." Clara took the bottle anyway and poured it down the sink. The doctor called her hysterical. Her father called her disrespectful. Her mother called her brave. For once the words did not contradict. The next year blurred. Illness was a thief with good manners. It knocked, entered, and took quietly. Some mornings, her mother woke lucid and bright, telling stories of the garden and its forgiving soil. Other days, she drifted in and out of time, murmuring apologies to people who were long dead. Clara read aloud to her, not for comfort, but to keep the air full of sentences that didn't end with regret. When the end came, it was gentle. The nurse said she passed in her sleep, which was poetic but inaccurate. She had spent too many years chasing sleep to surrender to it easily. Clara found her with one hand resting over the envelope marked, "For when I am no longer useful." She buried her with the letter still sealed. In the garden, she planted lilies on the patch where the bottles once lay. They bloomed early that year, pale and unsteady but alive. And after the funeral, the house was unbearably clean. Silence returned, not the fragile kind, but the heavy kind that falls when a story finishes before you do. Clara sorted through her mother's things with the patience of a historian and the grief of a daughter who has seen too much dignity used as disguise. In the bottom drawer of the writing desk she found another envelope. No label this time, only her name in the familiar hand. Inside were 3 pages written without ornament. "My dearest Clara, if I have left you anything, I hope it is not fear. We inherit what we observe. You have watched me bury my ghosts, but ghosts have roots. They grow toward the next generation unless someone finally names them aloud. So name them. Speak of what hurt me, not as shame, but as weather that passed through the house and left the curtains trembling. Tell the truth even if it ruins the furniture. The bottle is not our inheritance. The silence is. Break that instead. Love, Mother." Clara read the letter 3 times. By the 3rd, she realized her mother's handwriting was steadier than it had been in years. The act of truth, it seemed, had cured more than medicine ever did. She kept the house, not because she loved it, but because she wanted to understand it. Every wall held a residue of whispered histories. She opened the windows, let the wind interfere. Dust rose like reluctant spirits. In the study she found her father's ledgers and her mother's diaries, each a different form of order. She burned the ledgers and kept the diaries. In the evenings she wrote essays, reflections, small rebellions in ink. At first, only for herself, then for others. She sent one to a new magazine printed in London, the Englishwoman's Review, under the title The Bottled Quiet. It described no names, no specifics, only the truth that too many women had been chemically silenced and called virtuous for it. She expected rejection. Instead, they printed it. Readers sent letters, some grateful, some scandalized. One wrote simply, "I thought it was only me. That was enough." Years unspooled again, this time under the electric hum of modernity. Clara grew into her 30s, then 40s. The corsets loosened, both literally and historically. The world was beginning to suspect that women possessed not just nerves, but minds. The chemists now asked for signatures. Laudanum became unfashionable, like whale oil and hysteria. Progress, imperfect, but real. She never married. Not out of disdain, but out of a promise to herself. No partnerships founded on silence. She taught, she wrote, she lectured quietly in drawing rooms where curiosity was still considered slightly improper. People began to call her Miss Harrow, which sounded stern until she smiled. Sometimes she dreamed of her mother walking in the garden, the same garden that still grew beyond her window. In the dream, the earth was full of glass roots, and each flower whispered a different apology. She would wake, walk outside barefoot, and feel the dew like forgiveness. One evening, years later, she received a visitor, a young journalist, eager, earnest, with ink on his cuffs. He was writing an article on the history of Victorian medicine, he said, and wanted to interview her about the old laudanum years. "Old?" she said. "They're not so old. They live in the blood of daughters." He hesitated, pen hovering. "You mean heredity?" "I mean memory." He asked polite questions. She gave impolite answers. When he left, he looked unsettled, which she considered a victory. After he'd gone, she took her tea to the garden. The lilies were still there, though fewer now. The soil had a patience she envied. She whispered into the dusk, "I've done as you asked, Mother. I've named it." And somewhere, a breeze, a tremor, a feeling, she thought she heard a reply. "Then rest, my love, but not too quietly." Clara died in 1921, in her sleep, which at last had learned to come honestly. In her will, she left the house to a cousin, the garden to the town, for the cultivation of ordinary beauty, and a small chest of papers to the British Library, sealed for 50 years. Inside were her writings, her mother's diaries, and one remaining empty bottle, cork intact. A note beneath it read, "Keep this as evidence that silence too can be addictive." Stige. When the chest was opened in 1971, historians found themselves reading 2 centuries of women speaking at last one whisper at a time. Echoes in glass. The archivist who opened the chest was not prepared for ghosts. She was a practical woman, trained in catalogues and caution, the sort who could recite accession numbers faster than lullabies. Her name was Margaret Finch, no relation, though the coincidence would later amuse her colleagues when they learned about the doctor in the papers. In 1971, she worked in the dim basement of the British Library, where air smelled of old ink and decisions. When the seal cracked, a faint scent escaped. Dust, lavender, and something sharper. Inside lay a stack of notebooks wrapped in faded ribbon, a few photographs, and one small brown bottle. The bottle was clean, empty, light as memory. Margaret held it to the light and saw the glass tremble, perhaps from her hand, perhaps from history trying to breathe. The label read only, "For nerves." She felt, unreasonably, as if someone had spoken her name. Archivists are not supposed to feel. They preserve feeling in acid-free folders. Yet the more Margaret read, the less distance she could maintain. Clara Harrow's essays were lucid, restrained, but between their sentences lived the pulse of something furious. Generations of women medicated into grace. Her mother's diaries were softer, full of apologies that sounded like prayers. The combination was devastating. Pain written twice, once in whisper, once in ink. By the time Margaret reached the last entry, Clara's note about silence being addictive, she was crying into her gloves. That night, at home in her small flat above a bakery, she sat with a cup of tea and thought about her own mother, a bottle of sleeping pills on the nightstand, a phrase repeated for years, just to take the edge off. Different century, same prescription. The next morning, Margaret signed a request for publication review. She believed the world should read these women. The papers caused a small storm. In 1973, the Times literary supplement published excerpts under the headline "Voices from the Quiet Century." Feminist scholars hailed it as revelation. Doctors grumbled about anachronistic sensationalism. Letters poured in from women who had watched their mothers dissolve under tranquilizers, from nurses who remembered handing out soothing pills like compliments, from daughters who recognized the sound of glass even without the label. One letter simply said, "I have never taken laudanum, but I have swallowed its descendants. Thank you for reminding me it has a family tree." Margaret pinned that note above her desk. The exhibition that followed, The Amber Quiet, Women and Medicine, 1800-1950, filled the museum's upper hall. Visitors moved through cases of bottles, prescriptions, and handwritten prayers. In the centre stood Clara's bottle, under glass, illuminated like a relic. People whispered before it, as if afraid to wake something. Perhaps they were right. Among the visitors was a woman named Anna Reeves, a university student with dark hair and louder questions than her professors preferred. She came for a course requirement and stayed for 3 hours, reading every label, every diary fragment. Something inside her stirred. The strange recognition of inherited ache. Her grandmother, she remembered, had lived behind curtains most afternoons sipping tonic wine. Her mother took Valium in the 60s, prescribed for exhaustion. Anna had grown up knowing that women in her family were tired for reasons no doctor could diagnose. Now, standing before Clara Harrow's words, she began to understand. Tiredness was simply the modern accent of silence. She bought the exhibition catalogue and wrote in its margin, "We didn't stop. We just changed the bottle." Anna became a historian. People said she was obsessed. She called it continuity. Her doctoral thesis, Domestic Anesthesia, From Laudanum to Librium, traced a straight, painful line from Victorian apothecaries to 20th century pharmacies. She argued that addiction was not an individual weakness, but a social contract signed by those who needed women to stay calm. "Every age," she wrote, "has its acceptable opiate. We sell quiet under new brand names. The work won awards and enemies in equal measure. Pharmaceutical companies called it biased. Women wrote to thank her, some men too. But research alone couldn't contain the story. Anna found herself dreaming of Clara Harrow dreams vivid as confession. In one, Clara sat beside her at a modern kitchen table, frowning at a bottle of tranquilizers with 1960s typography. "Still amber," Clara said. "Still promises peace." Anna woke with the taste of dust and realization. She decided to make a documentary. But the film aired in 1982 on the BBC under the same title as the exhibition, The Amber Quiet. It opened with Clara's words, read in a calm voice over images of teacups and medicine cabinets. "We inherit what we observe. The bottle is not our inheritance, the silence is. Break that instead." Viewers wept. Critics called it unsettlingly beautiful. Schools requested copies. Parliament did not, though several MPs' wives wrote private notes of gratitude. Margaret Finch, now retired, watched it in her sitting room and thought of the bottle still under glass. She imagined Clara and her mother somewhere beyond history, watching women finally raise their voices without trembling. Then she laughed softly, because progress always comes disguised as déjà vu. Yet history, like addiction, has relapses. By the 1990s, new tonics had new names: antidepressants, anti-anxieties, sleep aids. Fewer corks, more child-proof caps. The chemistry had evolved, the loneliness had not. Advertising still whispered in the same, "Register soft, feminine, promising rest. Because you deserve peace. Because the world is loud. Because we care." Anna Reeves, older now, watched the commercials and felt both pride and despair. She gave lectures titled The Rebranded Quiet, holding up Clara's photograph beside a modern pillbox. "We must learn to distinguish healing from hush," she told audiences. "Sometimes they are identical in shape." In one interview, a journalist asked, "Do you blame medicine?" She smiled. "I blame anything that teaches women their pain is impolite." In 2005, a new exhibit opened, The Amber Lineage. It included recordings of modern women reading excerpts from 19th century diaries. Their accents varied: Indian, Caribbean, Scottish, American, but the emotion was eerily uniform. At the end, visitors could record their own reflections. Hundreds did. One voice, young and tired, said simply, "My mother takes pills to sleep. I take pills to stay awake. Somewhere between us is the right dosage of living." The curators left that message playing on a loop. Margaret Finch died in 2008. Among her papers, her niece found a short handwritten note. The bottle remains in the collection. Every few years someone asks why we keep it. I tell them it's the only artifact that listens. When I walk past, I swear it hums. The niece donated the note to the same archive. It was catalogued beside the diaries, the film, and a new set of oral histories recorded by Anna Reeves's students. Anna lived to see the internet era. She joked that humanity had finally invented a drug stronger than opium: distraction. "At least the Victorians had to mix theirs with tea," she said at her last lecture. She was 68, voice gravelly, humour intact. A student asked if she thought the cycle would ever end. "No," she said, "but we might recognise it sooner each time. Recognition is a kind of antidote." That night she returned to her flat, brewed tea, and sat by the window. On the table, a single lily in a glass vase bent slightly toward the light. She reached out, adjusted it, and whispered, "We've made it further than you thought, Clara." Decades later, a century now, the bottle rests behind museum glass. It is small, unimpressive, almost pretty. Tourists drift past. Some glance, most don't. History has many exhibits, Attention is finite, but occasionally someone stops, usually a woman, sometimes a man. They read the label, the story, the lines from Clara's letters printed beside it. Feeling, for all its discomfort, means presence. Presence, however flawed, is survival. They lean closer, as if the glass might offer instruction. Their reflections merge with the bottle's faint shine, and for an instant the centuries align: Victorian parlour, modern pharmacy, museum corridor, one long lineage of people trying not to feel too much and failing beautifully. The guard, watching from the corner, says visitors sometimes talk to it. Not prayers exactly, but thank yous. He's learned not to interrupt. Every spring the museum garden blooms with lilies grown from cuttings taken from Clara Harrow's old house before it was demolished. The gardener swears the soil there is unusually rich, almost luminous at dawn. He doesn't know about the bottles buried beneath. He just knows the flowers never die easily. And somewhere perhaps in the soft space between centuries, where stories go when they've been told too often and not enough, a mother and daughter walk through a field. The air smells of tea and rain. They are not ghosts, not exactly, they are continuations. The mother carries nothing in her hands. The daughter hums a tune that sounds suspiciously like the clink of glass turning into music. When they reach the edge of the field, the mother says, "Listen." The wind answers, not silence, but something living. The opposite of quiet, the sound of everything that was once contained, finally spilling into the open. The age of soft screens. The first time she saw the story, it was by accident. A midnight scroll, a sleepless algorithm, a thumbnail of a glass bottle glowing on a museum shelf. She clicked because insomnia makes archaeologists of us all. The short documentary had been uploaded from some cultural channel with modest views and impeccable subtitles. The title read, "The Amber Quiet: Women, Opium, and the Invention of Silence." The voiceover was calm, British, and devastating. She expected dates, statistics, maybe scandal. What she got was lineage. The narrator spoke of a Victorian woman who took laudanum to survive her afternoons, of her daughter who buried the bottles, of her descendants who learned to call their pain nerves, exhaustion, burnout. And suddenly the viewer, her name was Eleanor, 32, caffeine-sustained, Serenity subscriptioned, was crying over people who had been dead for 100 years. She paused the video and stared at her own reflection on the screen, eyes glassy, phone light painting her face like a ghost trying to remember itself. On the nightstand sat a half-empty bottle of melatonin, a packet of herbal calm tea, a diffuser promising emotional clarity, and a box of sleeping pills prescribed during what she and her doctor called the difficult quarter. The labels were gentle. The effect was not. She whispered to the screen, "We didn't bury it. We digitized it." Then she pressed play again. The video showed Clara Harrow's handwriting, digitized from the archives. "The bottle is not our inheritance. The silence is. Break that instead." Eleanor leaned back and let those words rearrange her. She thought of her grandmother, who had always called herself nervous, who never finished a sentence without apologizing halfway through. Of her mother permanently tired, living on small white tablets that promised calm and delivered blur. Of herself, always performing wellness, always promising she'd meditate tomorrow. Generations of women, each more educated, more liberated, and somehow more exhausted. She closed her laptop, switched off the diffuser, and opened her window. Outside, the city breathed, restless, glowing, beautiful, unhealed. She felt a pang that was both old and entirely hers. The next morning, she searched for everything about Clara Harrow. There were academic papers, digitized letters, even an Instagram account run by a museum intern posting excerpts in cursive font over sepia backdrops. Each quote was a spark of raw sanity. Feeling for all its discomfort means presence. Peace should not require surrender. Every cure that silences you is only another wound in disguise. Eleanor screenshot them all, not for posting, just for proof. That afternoon she visited the museum itself. She told herself it was for research, but she knew better. Some pilgrimages are simply about asking permission to feel. The exhibit was quieter than expected. No crowds, just a few students and a security guard reading the news on his phone. The lighting was deliberate, warm, subdued, the colour of breath before it leaves the body. She followed the panels through time, the bottles, the letters, the photographs. Then she found it, the small glass vial, perfectly ordinary, perfectly devastating. The label had faded almost to illegibility, but the plaque beneath it read, "Laudanum bottle, C, 1870, belonged to Clara Harrow's mother, donated to the British Library collection, 1921. When I walk past, I swear it hums," archivist's note. Eleanor stood there for a long time. The hum, she thought, wasn't in the bottle, it was in her. A museum attendant approached, young, kind-eyed, wearing the weary smile of those who watch strangers cry in public. "First time seeing it?" he asked softly. "Yes," she said, "and somehow the second." He nodded, as if he understood exactly. "A lot of people say that. Do you ever feel," she asked, "that it's not just history? That it's still happening?" "All the time," he said. "But that's why we show it, to remind people it doesn't have to." She thanked him, though she wasn't sure for what. Before leaving, she leaned toward the glass and whispered, "I'm awake now, I promise." And for a fleeting second, perhaps just imagination, something inside the bottle seemed to shimmer as though the century itself had exhaled. Back home, she wrote, "At first it was just a poster-captioned photo of the museum display tagged the Amber Quiet." But her words came fast, sharper than she meant. "My great-grandmother had tranquilizers. My grandmother had nerve pills. My mother had sleep aids. I have apps that tell me when to breathe. Same story, new pharmacy. Maybe healing starts when we stop mistaking silence for peace." Within hours it went viral. Tens of thousands of likes, then shares, then stitched videos of other women holding up their own bottles, antidepressants, anxiety meds, candles, gin. Some cried, some laughed. One woman whispered, "I thought I was the only one who needed permission to stop pretending." The internet for one night felt like a confession circle. A week later, a journalist contacted Eleanor for an interview. They wanted to know why her words resonated. She said, "Because everyone's tired of performing serenity. We inherited the hush, not the calm." They asked if she was against medication. "No," she said. "I'm against sedation without understanding. I'm against calling numbness self-care." When the article came out, the headline read, "The Amber Quiet Goes Viral." The subheading, "From Victorian Laudanum to Digital Burnout, Why Women Still Seek the Perfect Calm." Eleanor saved a copy. Not out of pride, but out of disbelief that something so old could still pulse under new skin. Messages flooded in emails, comments, letters from strangers who began with, "I've never told anyone this," but some were heartbreaking, some hopeful. A nurse wrote, "We still prescribe silence. It just tastes different now." A teenager wrote, "Your post made my mum talk about her pills for the first time." One man wrote, "My wife died last year. The doctor said she was finally at peace. I hate that word now." Eleanor read everyone, cried over most, answered a few. She understood now why Clara had written her essays. Truth doesn't end pain, it redistributes it more honestly. One night, she dreamed of the garden. Not her own small balcony with dying herbs, but the garden, the one from the story. Moonlight, lilies, earth heavy with memory. She knelt beside the mound where the bottles were buried. Someone was there, a woman in a plain dress, hair coiled, face both familiar and forgotten. "Clara," Eleanor whispered. The woman smiled faintly. "Names change. The ache doesn't." "What should we do with it?" "Live anyway," said the ghost, "and speak. Always speak." Eleanor reached for her hand, but the dream dissolved into morning light. She began giving talks first at universities, then community centres, then online panels. Titles like The Legacy of Quiet, Inherited Calm, The Feminine of Numb. She spoke not as an expert, but as a witness. She quoted Clara Harrow. She quoted her mother. She quoted herself. Audiences listened, some nodding, some uncomfortable. That was the point. After one lecture, a young woman approached her, hands trembling. "My grandmother used to mix her pills with sherry," she said. "I found the bottles after she died. I didn't know what to do with them." "Keep one," Eleanor said, "not as a warning, as a witness." The girl smiled through tears. "Like a relic?" "No," Eleanor said, "like a mirror." Years passed. The movement she accidentally started evolved into something larger, part history, part advocacy, part reclamation. The museum updated the exhibit, adding a final panel titled The Present Tense. It displayed a collage of photographs sent by women around the world, pill bottles, meditation apps, screens glowing at midnight. At the centre, Clara's bottle still sat quietly, now surrounded by its digital descendants. A new quote appeared beneath it. Eleanor's words, "We learn to whisper across centuries, now let's learn to answer." Visitors wrote their reflections on small cards. Some were angry, some hopeful. One read simply, "It's not silence I want anymore, it's understanding." Eleanor aged with the story. She became, to her surprise, someone people quoted. But in her private life, she remained a woman with sleepless nights and a cabinet of half-solved problems. Healing, she'd learned, isn't a destination. It's a conversation that refuses to end. Sometimes she returned to the museum alone, sitting on the bench opposite the bottle. She imagined Clara beside her, older now too, both of them watching their shared ghost rest under glass. Once she whispered, "Do you think we did it? Broke the silence?" And though the air did not move, the glass seemed to catch the light just so, an amber flicker, small but alive. She took that as an answer. Years later, long after hashtags faded and historians found new revolutions, the museum installed an interactive version of the Amber Quiet. Visitors could record their own reflections. Some spoke in whispers, others shouted, some simply breathed. The recordings layered over time, creating a soft chorus that filled the room. The sound was neither mourning nor triumph, it was presence. A plaque by the exit read, "Silence was never peace. Speak, even softly. Someone a century from now will hear you." Outside, the garden still bloomed every spring. No one remembered the exact spot where the first bottles were buried, and that somehow was fitting. The earth had digested sorrow and returned flowers. The lilies leaned toward the sun, as they always had. Eleanor, old now, sometimes sat there with a notebook. She no longer wrote manifestos, just small observations, half poetry, half prayer. The past is not over. It just speaks through different mouths. Calm is not silence. Calm is honesty allowed to breathe. She died quietly, not sedated, not silenced, just asleep, the kind of rest her foremothers had once been promised in amber. At her memorial, friends read her favourite passage from Clara's last letter. Presence, however flawed, is survival. And afterward, someone placed a single lily on her grave, wrapped in a ribbon the colour of tea. No bottles, no hush. Only the sound of bees and wind continuing the conversation. In a future not yet written, a young girl doing homework for a history class will search Victorian opium women and find a short clip titled The Amber Quiet. She'll listen to the voice narrating it, Eleanor's voice, remastered, timeless, and she'll pause halfway through, feeling something move inside her. Not sadness, not guilt, just recognition. She won't know why she whispers to her screen, "I'm awake, I promise." But somewhere beyond time, beyond bottles, beyond all the soft prisons built for peace, someone will whisper back, "We hear you."